So, hey everyone, my name is Aivis. I'm going to be the host today, and there are a couple of ground rules as always, right? Not a lot of them, but just a few. So, one of them is if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them. There's one thing that I support and I stand by is that there is no such thing as stupid questions. If you have something, ask about it. I'll try to answer every single possible question that's there. If I don't manage to do it in time, we'll try to follow up afterwards and via emails. Or the other option that you can do is, for example, if you don't just feel comfortable by sending in the question itself in the chat, right? You want to take it kind of offline in a sense, right? What you can do is you can send an email to webinars@zoomcharts.com. So if Leanna could paste in the email address, you can send your questions to that email and we're going to get back to you. So there are multiple ways on how you can reach us. That's one way. The other thing is in the challenge itself, don't forget that you have an option also to book these one-on-one sessions. So that's also a great way on how you can ask questions regarding a specific setup, specific visual, or anything like that. Now, the other ground rule that I have is if you do have any questions, I encourage you and I please beg for your understanding, post your questions in the Q&A section of the chat. So when you open up the chat, there's going to be two tabs. You have a chat and you have a Q&A only. So for Q&A questions, post them there because it's going to be a lot easier for me to find them in some sort of an order, right? Rather than go scroll through the whole chat and trying to find if I accidentally missed something. That's about it. Other than that, I hope you enjoy. Hope you learned something new and actually meaningful today. If not, then tell us about it as well. Because one of the things that we're going to do at the very end, for those of you who have been, you already know where I'm going with this. For those of you who are new, we're going to be sending out a feedback form. Don't kind of get afraid of it. There's not going to be a lot of questions. It's just basically 4 or 5, I think, questions that help us to understand if the webinar is on the right track. If you're getting the information that you were looking for, is there anything missing from it, anything that you want us to cover additionally, and so forth. So just be sure that before you leave, you mention that you want to get the link to the feedback form. If you want to leave earlier, if you're staying to the end, we're going to paste it in the chat, so no worries about it. All right. Hey, Rohit. Rohit says, this is my first data challenge. Excited to see how I can visualize the data right now. I'm on my way home, so we'll be listening to this webinar while I drive home. Hey, man, that's one way to do it, right? Just pay attention to the road. That's the main thing. Because, yeah, one thing that everybody has to remember is you do have the option of, for example, if you do have to jump off, or if you can just listen, you can listen to the webinars, and the recordings of the webinars will be sent afterwards. So you can always watch the webinar afterwards at your own time, go through specific segments of the webinar where I talk about this or that, and just focus on something specifically if that's what piques your interest at that point. Okay? All right. Hey, Salomon. Happy you're doing good. Yeah, and like I said, hope you guys get something out of this event, because what I usually say is, right, I want to make sure that you learn something not just new, because learning something new is very easy, but you actually learn something new and useful. That's the most important thing for me. All right, so a little bit about the agenda. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at the Udemy course dataset, and we're going to focus on what visuals could be used for the exploration of the dataset. Now, I'm not going to go through all 10 of our visuals. Why? Because every single data set in one way or another could be looked at with every single one of these visuals, right? What I'm focused on is, let's call them core visuals. So visuals that you see in almost 90% of the report. Because things like network charts, waterfall charts, they are common, but for specific fields and industries and use cases. Whereas columns, lines, areas, donut charts, and these sort of things are pretty much in every single report. So I'm going to be focusing on those and try to explain how you can utilize them. We can also cover some other practical tips that you could utilize during the challenge and create an even better experience for the users. And at the very end, like I said, I'm going to try to answer all your questions. If I see that a question is relevant to what I'm showcasing right now, I'm going to try to answer it on the go. If not, we're going to have a separate time block at the end where I can go through all the questions that I haven't yet answered. All right, without further ado, I think we're ready to go, right? So let's just quickly move some screens around. There we go. Move this here, and let's start sharing the screen. There we go. Hiding this button, hiding that button, click on that, so everything's good. All right. One of the things that I wanted to remind you guys as well is I'm going to paste in the chat a link. And every single one of you who downloaded the dataset, you also get a copy of this document. What this document is basically what we call just a visual cheat sheet. So for those of you who have been working with some of the ZoomCharts visuals, you know what they're capable of and what different charting types they cover. For those of you who are new, you have no idea what, for example, the combo visual stand for. So what we're doing is giving you a visual identification of what visual from our side can be covered with one of the native visuals. So for example, if you had areas, you can cover it with a combo chart. If you had areas, but you were using time or date-based data, you can use the timeline or the time series visual. So it's a quick reference so you can understand, okay, what I could replace with what visual and what I can try out to see, what's the benefit, what's the added value of using this over that, and those sort of things. So feel free to use it, save it, bookmark it, whatever kind of works for you best. I know some people like to download the documents and have a specific folder for them. Some of them, I personally, for example, have just a bunch of different bookmarks. Hey, whatever works for you, use that. The drawback for the bookmark thing is that, links can disappear, whereas a file usually stands where it is. All right. So let's go into the dataset. So within the dataset, we actually have two different sheets. We do this usually for all the challenges. So we have one page where you have sort of like definitions, descriptions of the data columns that you have within the data source. So you can see things like course ID, that's unique identifier for each course title, that's the name of the course, and so forth. And what I like to do when I'm creating reports is I do not remove this information. I keep it within the report. Now, I know it might seem obsolete, like, okay, but why do you need it? I can just open up the Excel. Sure, but I just want to have everything by hand. Because at any point of time, when I'm done with the report, I can remove this information, I can remove this table, I can remove the query, I can remove any visuals associated with it. That's not the issue. I just want everything to be at a grasp. So what I usually do in reports is I create just one simple page at the very beginning. Usually I call it definitions, descriptions, or however I feel at the time. And I create a basic table. I could go, for example, and say, let's say global font. Also increase it so it's a little bit easier to notice. Leave it at 14. There's not that many columns, and just leave it basically like this. I don't do anything else with it. In some cases, we use these pages for references to the user. So that allows them to basically look at the name of the columns if somebody's creating their version of the report. If not, you can remove it. So I keep it there because when I'm creating the visuals and I'm looking at the data, so for example, let's say I'm in a completely blank canvas, right? I look at the right-hand side and I'm like, okay, there are different columns, course ID, course hour, is paid. What is his paid column? I open up the table view, I go to the data set, I find is paid, so basically it's true or false. So my guess is that this would identify whether or not this course has a price associated with it. If I have definitions, I don't have to think about those things. I just go to the definitions. I see column name is paid, indicates whether the course is paid or free. All right, pretty understandable. Nothing more here to ask. So this one is one of the little tips that I can recommend to you, for example, in cases where you do have these definitions. If you don't have the definitions, one of the things that I could also recommend is write one. Because trust me, that's it. It might seem like a little bit of waste of time initially, but in the long term, it saves a lot of time because everybody who looks at the data set can understand what these columns mean. Because we all know how much we like different abbreviations and unique names for different categories and everything. When you're in the data source, you know what it means. If anybody new, you have to, for example, explain things to him. So that's how it allows you to do these things. All right, so going back to the visuals, one thing that we could do is if we look at the data, we see course ID, course title, URL, different numerical columns, and we also have a date. So one of the things that I wanted to create today with you guys is to create a timeline visual. And the reason why I want to create a timeline visual is because the setup is a little bit different from the native visuals. So once we first add it, you're going to notice that we have 3 fields that are mandatory, and the rest of the fields are completely optional. For those of you who have been longer with us, remember the last time I mentioned also that right now we're releasing the Legends field. So I can happily announce that it's publicly available now in the app stores. So you can fully utilize it, and I'm going to showcase what interesting things you can do with it. But for the setup of the timeline visual, so what usually kind of, let's say, raises an eyebrow for people who are using this for the first time is that we have date hierarchy, date value, legend series. So how do I set it up? The setup is pretty simple. If you have a date calendar, for example, just a native hierarchy that Power BI recognizes as a date field, and it creates the hierarchy. All you have to do here is this simple. You take the field and you drag it in. So what basically this allows you to do is to define the hierarchy levels that are going to be visible within the visual. And if you hover over the name date hierarchy, you have a little tooltip which explains also the supported granularities. So you can see we also have granularities like 5 seconds, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, hours, and so forth. The lowest level we support actually on the time axis is milliseconds, and the highest level on the date axis is, if I'm not mistaken, decades. So there are interesting things that you can do with this. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a native hierarchy. Because, for example, in some cases, you don't have a date field itself, you just have different components. So you have year separately, you have month separately, and you have a day separately, for example. In those cases, you can still use this, just drag in those individual fields, and that's going to define the hierarchy. Now, the next field here is the date value x-axis. And you come to it and you're like, okay, it's another date. What's the difference between the previous one and this one? Pretty simple. Here, you specifically define the hierarchy. Those are going to be the units that you're going to be using for the visual. Now, the date value itself is a regular date field. I can use the same one if I don't have a separate one. And this allows the visual to connect the date to the levels of the hierarchy. This is what creates that connection for the dataset and the visual. And the last thing that we're missing here is, you can see it also here, please select at least one value. Makes sense, right? We only have dates. The visual doesn't really have anything to showcase right now. So we could go for something like, I don't know, let's say course ID, sum of course ID. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Because course ID is a unique identifier, not something you can sum up. So I can quickly switch it to, for example, count distinct. Now this is counting the unique numbers within the appropriate date hierarchy. Now once we set it up, the further exploration is pretty simple. We click, for example, in 2016, and you can see I switch from years to quarters. I click on one of the quarters, I go down to months. I click on one of the months, I go down to days. So you see where I'm going with this. But the reason why in some cases people kind of don't understand why we need this whole connection, why can't you just use regular, kind of categorical approach? The reason for that is this. If I, for example, take the same course ID and create it as a card and go again with the distinct count, what we allow you to do with the timeline visuals is you can actually select any custom time period on the x-axis. Seems like I didn't clear our filter previously. So for example, right now I'm hovering over 2 years, and that is giving me a total of 2.2K courses. What's also interesting about this, that the selection can always be modified. I can increase it, I can decrease it from both sides. And if I click on the highlighted area, you can see I drill down into these 2 specific years. Now you're going to be thinking like, well, okay, that's not something super unique, right? I can do a drill down also on native visuals. Sure. But one thing that you can do is select that custom time period, for example, that splits between multiple years, and then zoom in on those. So this is one of the things that we're doing with the timeline visuals. We're giving you the opportunity to actually explore and navigate the data by interacting with the visuals directly. You're selecting the time periods, you're zooming in, you're manually adjusting them. What's also good about this is that all the data is actually kept in memory. So for example, even though I zoomed in into these 5 specific months, I showcase this to the managers and they're like, okay, but what happened? In this case, we have October 2015. What happened 1 month prior? Usually what you would do is go back, select another month, zoom in. In this case, I can just physically move it to the right, to the left. I can move it upwards to zoom out. I can move it downwards to zoom in. So think about using the same report, for example, not only on desktop devices where you have a mouse and just a regular PC, right? You're using this also on touch-driven devices, tablets, phones, and all these interactions is what allows you to seamlessly navigate that data. So a lot of different interesting things, and which might be a little bit confusing at first. I get it. If you would think about how things have developed, an interactive report, right? If you look at the definition, an interactive report means that, or interactive visual means that if I hover over the name, not the name, but the column, I get a tooltip. By definition, that is an interactive visual. In all honesty, I wouldn't say that it's an interactive visual. It's just a tooltip, right? There's nothing super interactive about it. So once I set it up, like I said, we also do have the legends field. And for all of our visuals, one thing that I would recommend to use whenever you're playing around with it or setting it up is to go under toolbar and enable the reset button. So you can see reset is a toolbar item. And the main idea about it is it allows you to clear the filters from this particular visual and get back to the initial state. So you don't have to create a bookmark for this. The visual knows its initial state, and that's how you can drive it. What's also interesting about this is you can change the display units. Now, this seems like, okay, I can do this with the native visuals as well, right? Just by using the expand to next level. Sure, you can do that. What you can also do with our visual is that if you go to initial display unit, you see we have different modes available. So here you can define whether you want to start with the top hierarchy level or you want to start with the bottom one. So the top means I'm on a yearly level. If I switch it to the bottom one and I refresh the page, so give the chart a fresh load, you can see now I'm on daily basis. And by clicking on zoom out, I go one level up in the hierarchy. So day, month, quarter, and year. If you say that, okay, that's all cool, but I want to have something custom. Sure. Switch it to custom and then define which is going to be the granularity for the initial display. I set it on quarters. Again, give the page a fresh reload. And now I'm on a quarterly level. So basically think about as the chart is just an expression of how to visualize the data, right? You're in control of what's visible, how do you do this, how the user interacts with it, and so forth. All right, we did that. What else? Legends. Like I said, that's something interesting that we did, and we want to showcase how its applications can actually enhance your reports. So most of you are probably familiar with what Legends field does. For those of you who are not familiar with it, what Legends field does is it splits the value of, for example, in this case, let's consider one quarter to be a category, right? That's the category, that's one column. It allows you to split the column by a subcategory. And the subcategory, for example, in this case, could be something like subject. So we have 4 different subjects. Yeah, 4 different ones. And you can see that one column just turned into 4 ones. So by default, we're creating a clustered column chart. But you look at it and you're like, yeah, but it would kind of be cool if I could create a stacked column chart, right? Sure. Go to the formatting options, series defaults, because you want to combine all of the columns right now. And here, you simply say that I want to change from cluster to stack. That's it. At some point, you want to say, okay, that's all good, but I want to have also a line on top of it. Okay, let's say I'm using total sales. So total sales is using a SumX function, and the SumX is just multiplying price with the number of subscribers. That gives me the understanding of how much has the course made. And I add it to series too. What happens by default is, well, they're both split because they both are, in the data set. And based on the subject, we can split all of them apart. But the user says that, hey, I want to see the count split, but the amounts or the total sales actually as one line. Okay, so how do you do that? You go into the formatting options and you choose the series that you want to customize now. So in this case, the total sales. All you have to do is click on this, customize this series. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So customize this series. And the next trick you do is pretty simple. Right underneath it, split by legend. So if I disable it, you can see that the count in the tooltip is split by different subjects, whereas the total sales is showing me the total as one particular value. Now, sure, now it's a column. I can make it a line. If you look at the values, in one case, the count is 1K, right? Whereas the total sales is 214 million. That's not really in the same scale range, right? So what do? We can always think about the chart that has multiple axes. So what I do is I enable the secondary axis here because the user needs to see the values. And then I go to series 2 and find the setting for value axis and switch it also to secondary. Now the color choice, you're probably going to agree with me, it ain't the best one, right? Because total sales is the same color as graphic design. So what do? We customize it. Again, you have full flexibility of customizing almost every single aspect of the visual. So by adjusting this, you can kind of see where this is going, right? We have one single visual, the timeline visual, but it's supporting 3 different chart types: columns, lines, and areas. You have in the data fields 25 different series. So those are the numerical values that you plot. So you can have 25 columns, lines, areas, or any combination between these 3 chart types. Stacked columns, clustered columns, combinations with lines, areas, different, let's say like that. You can kind of go pretty crazy with it. And you can also create with a little bit of creative thinking, I would put it like that. You can convert this chart to look like a box and whiskers visual, a candlestick chart, a bullet chart, a lollipop chart, sometimes it's always called, a Dumbo chart. There's a lot of different variations on what you can do with it, right? Some cases you have to modify the data a little bit to support your case, but the main idea about the visual is that it's as flexible as it can be without ruining the whole concept, right? So that's something that allows you to kind of explore different paths and unique combinations of visuals, even though you're using the same data. What else is there? Let's say at some point somebody says, okay, this is all looking good and everything, but I don't want to have these colors. Yeah, one thing I forgot. Whenever you use something with a split color mechanism, so if you use a legends field or if you use multiple colors, help the user to understand what is what. Meaning, enable the legend itself. Allow the user to go through the data and read it and understand, okay, so this color is that. Because the only option without hovering over it, you don't really know what is what. So legends is something that allows the user to understand, okay, what is what. So that's one of the things. What was I trying to do? Yeah. So let's say somebody doesn't want this 4-color scheme. He just wants to have, again, just a total number. All right. I completely remove the legend. But let's say what I am interested in is a little bit of conditional formatting. And I see that we also have a question regarding the conditional formatting. So you can have conditional formatting on the series. If you go to formatting options, for example, series 1 configuration, and at the bottom right here, you enable conditional formatting. And that opens up a new can of formatting options that can be applied. We have 4 different coloring modes. So we have solid horizontal, vertical, stepped colors, and gradients. Gradient, for example, this sort of, and for the gradient, you can also define whether it's vertical or horizontal in some cases. You have the stepped colors, meaning that the whole bar or the column, depending on the orientation, is always going to be one color specifically. And then we have these two, which is usually something that causes a little bit of confusion as to, okay, which one am I supposed to use and what's the added benefit of it? So what I'm going to do for this is add also a threshold. So I'm going to add a threshold. I enable it. And I go and say that the value type is going to be an average. I'm going to base it on series 1, which is going to be my quantity. Because quantity is on the columns, and the total sales is the line, right? So I want to focus on the quantity right now. And I'm going to say it's based on average. I'm also going to go and enable the label for it so that the user sees what is the value for that line. But I think you can agree with me, just having a line with a value doesn't really tell me a lot, right? Okay, it's 146.88. What is 146.88? Count, sum, what is it? So we have a label text, and you can say, for example, this is the average count of courses. So that gives it a name and a purpose. Now, once we have it, I'm going to go back to the conditional formatting of series 1. And first off, keep it on solid H color. So what does the H and V stand for, right? Solid H color, solid V color. Horizontal or vertical. That is the axis on which you are coloring the columns. So for example, if I choose solid H color, it means that every single column that is going to be below the average, that's the rule that I've set up so far, is going to be in color red. Everything that's above is going to be in color green. In other cases, somebody might want to say, hey, but I don't want to color the whole column. I just want to color the part that is above the average. And that is why we have this solid vertical coloring. And you can see kind of where the difference is, right? For example, on solid H, all these were completely green. If I enable the solid V color, it stops right here at the average line. What's also interesting about the average calculations is that it is based on the visible viewport. What does it mean? If I get closer to it, it redefines where the average line is. So that allows you to have some interesting tricks or views happening there. It's just something that allows you to play around with how the visual works. So keeping that in mind, you can of course also enable this middle color if you want to, sort of like a transition color. But in this case, we don't really have any transition points because the values are going either below or above the average. If they're right on top of the average, you probably have a little yellow line here, but the threshold is on top of it again. So always think about whether or not you need the elements that you're trying to add there. That's one of the things. Now, what else is? We do have a couple of questions. Let's quickly see them. I have a query regarding the coordinate radius of drill down combo bar. When I increase the coordinate radius, the bar, it appears the coordinate radius on both sides. Is there any way to apply coordinate radius to only one side? Pramadesh, so currently the border radius, not the coordinate radius, but the coordinate radius is a setting that is applied to both sides. There is no way to define whether you want to have it at the top or at the bottom, or the left or the right, depending on the orientation of the chart. Zulay, can we conditionally format the bars in the timeline combo bar? That's a new visual, but you can do it both in the timeline and in the combo bar visual. The only thing that's going to be different is that you're going to notice that the conditional formatting itself doesn't utilize the traditional conditional formatting box. That is because it's not something that we can replicate directly without infringing any rights with Microsoft. So we're doing it differently. All right, let's see, a few more Q&A. Oh wow, there's a lot. Let's go through one or two, and then I'll leave the rest for later. All right, so Salman, which option was used to set the average line? So for the average line, what I did is I went into thresholds, so this block right here. I enabled it first, because at first it's disabled. Open it up. The type for the threshold, I kept it as a line, but you can also set it up as an area. So for example, I can say that everything starting from below and going up to the average is sort of like a colored area. But I'm just going to keep it a line. The value type means the sort of aggregation you're using for it. I'm using the average, but you could also use it as a constant value if you have some specific KPI you want to reach, for example. Then you choose the series based upon which you're doing the calculations. And then it's purely cosmetic and formatting options to visually style it. I hope that answers your question, Salman. Prominent hash app, we already covered that. Question from Aivis. Am I right to understanding that the legends field is applied on top of the series values per each category? The visual will first assign series values on their x-axis spots with the category field and then divide that value with the legend to create stacked or cluster. So what it essentially does, once you add the legend field, it adds more depth to the visual. Think about it like having a matrix table, right? So first, let's say we're going to be adding just high-level estimates of year on rows. And then I say this is going to be for the course ID, which is based on the distinct count. What I'm doing with the legends field is I'm basically adding another layer on the rows. So for example, if I go for subject, which then allows the visual to understand what categories are underneath each of the years, and based on that calculate the results, because it already has it in the data. It's just a matter of connecting the dots. Okay, what else? Power BI report should include, comment from Leon as well. So I think we had a question in the chat. How many visuals do you need to have? So for this challenge, you need to have at least 2 visuals on the same page. That is one of the requirements. Okay. Question as well, how to change fonts in ZoomCharts visuals? Sure. So in order to change the fonts, let's say on the x-axis, I go to the x-axis itself. You're going to see there's an empty text field, which is font family. And basically what you do is you type in the name of the font family times New Roman, for example. And that changes the look and the feel of the labels. So you have to manually enter it. Probably going to be improved at some point later on, but now with the highest priority, definitely, because there is a way on how you can do it. It's maybe not the easiest one straight away, but you can do it. So what we do is we try to focus on things that enhance, let's call it like that. We focus on things that give users the most benefit, right? Makes sense. Another one, why is it worth using ZoomCharts visuals in general? So let's put it like that. One of the main reasons why I recommend using our visuals over the native visuals isn't necessarily that one or the other is, better or worse or something like that. There are different ways on how you can explore reports. So one of the things that those of you who have used any reports know that cross-chart filtering is a very cool feature that also native visuals can do, but it's not the easiest one to utilize. So with the native visuals, you always have to remember holding down control when you interact with multiple visuals. What we try to do is the visuals are acting as slicers. So every single time you click on one of the slices, for example, that filters out the data. You click on one of the years to zoom in, that passes out a filter. So every single action that you do passes out that particular filter. Sure, there might be cases where native visuals are, more tended towards, and there are cases where ZoomCharts visuals are better. One of the most important things that I would emphasize on is the user experience, right? Because you want to create a report which is as easy to understand as possible. And even if we go for something like a simple donut chart, right? Okay, I wanted to copy the donuts. Okay, thank you. Let's try it again. Click on the visual, new page, copy the donut chart. That's what I wanted to do. And let's have a side-by-side comparison between the two. They're both going to be showing exactly the same data. I just converted one of them ours, the other one is native visual. So even a simple action as a drill down simply click on one of the slices and it does the drill down, right? The other thing that we do here is you can see these inner reference layers that we create. Every single drill down is being referenced in the center of the donut chart. So that allows you for better storytelling. Because let's be honest, the normal average person's attention span is decreasing by the day, I would say. So what happens in reality is we get a phone call, we get an email, we get distracted, something happens in the background. And if somebody was presenting something and did, for example, something like this, so imagine you're looking away for a screen for just a second. And in the meantime, what I do is I do a drill down. Now, can you tell me what I did in order to get here? Unless you have specific measures that tell you what exactly has been filtered and so forth, the answer is no. What you're doing is you're looking at a brand new chart that has absolutely no connection to the previous one. That's what your brain sees. So what we try to eliminate is this confusion for the user. So for example, if I drill down, that's why we have the inner reference layers. It showcases you the slice, the color, the position, everything regarding the previously selected slice. So if somebody comes back, even after 2 or 3 minutes, you can look at the chart and see, okay, I need to filter out this slice, then I'm selecting this slice, and I get to the end result. That's one of the things. The other one is just the pure flexibility of the charts. Sure, we might not have every single possible feature that's out there or any possible setting or formatting option that's out there. Yes, but that is why we encourage you to tell us what you're missing. At the end of the day, we're not creating charts just because we want to, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to create charts that are solving real life problems. Sure, it might seem like an over drastic recreation, right? Real life problems in data visualization, that doesn't exist. But there are problems that we're facing every single day. How to visualize it, how to tell a story, and what is the best way on how to convey the story to the user. And that is done through the visuals. Now, what's the most important part of the visuals is the formatting. So tell us what you're missing, tell us what you like, what you dislike, and so forth. And that helps us to understand, okay, what should we focus on next? Because the last thing we want to do is add a feature just because, I felt like it. It seemed good, so I added it. So we try to always build the visual based on actual requirements. So that goes for that. Columns, lines, conditional formatting. Let's see. We have more questions. Pratmahesh, is there any limit on number of pages we can create in the report for the challenge? Let me check. Judging criteria. True. The number of pages is not limited. As many pages as you want. The only criteria is that at least one of those pages has to contain at least 2 drill down visuals. As how many pages you want to create, go crazy. Salman, what are your best practices for great storytelling? For great storytelling, what I would recommend is think about the user itself first. Who is let's say, the user or the audience that's going to be seeing this, and actually trying to understand it? Is it a person who's tech savvy? What I mean by it is he somebody who you would give, let's say, a report like this, where there's a lot of moving parts to it, where every click filters something out? Or is he a person who's been more familiar with just the Excel file itself? Based on that, cater the visuals that you are developing. Your main responsibility as a report developer is not to create a report that just answers the questions. It is to provide them with something that is actionable and useful. And it looks good. That's always a bonus. So create the visuals catered to your audience. If you know that your user is used to having donut charts, tables, and something like this, for example, right? Just a timeline, donut chart, and a table. There's no reason for you to suddenly implement a graph chart. You can do it as an option and say, hey, we have these 2 variations. You can choose one of them, whichever floats your boat the best, right? Because you can understand it. But if there are going to be the users who are going to be using every single day, you cannot create a report which causes confusion. You have to create something that they understand and like to use. because that's the way in how you can actually transfer that information. For some of you who have been longer here, and this is not your first challenge, you've heard me saying this before. My best experience is with the problem of understand, not the problem, but the reason why I emphasize so much on the end users is when we started to transfer all of the reports that we have at ZoomCharts to be built within Power BI with our visuals, right? Makes sense. Kind of want to use your own product, right? Understand what's the benefit of it. So when we started to do it is I started to transfer all the reports to the Power BI environment. And one of the reports that I was transferring was from our CRM system. I got in touch with the sales manager to understand all the KPIs that he needs, all the questions that the report needs to answer. I talked with the end users just to understand, okay, what's going on, how you're going to be using this, and so forth. Everything seemed fine. And one thing that I learned from it, first of all, is always create milestones. So sort of like create points where you can check on the progress. Am I going in the right direction, or is this making no sense whatsoever? Right? Communicate with them. That's key point. But the main problem with that report at the very end was I created it. It answered every single question that the sales manager put in front of me. It answered also those additional edge case questions, which the sales guy told me. But I looked at the usage of the report, and the report was being used basically by 2 users once a week. Now, bear in mind, the report was supposed to be a daily sales report, right? Something seems off. And for me, I started to investigate it further. So, okay, what's causing the problem, right? The report is answering all the questions that you put in front of me. Why are you not using it? And the question just blew my mind. Well, you see, on the CRM system, each product has its own color, and we're used to it. In your report, these colors are mixed up. So it gave us a lot of unnecessary time when we had to think about and read the data and everything. And I'm like, you do realize, guys, that changing colors is basically taking 1 or 2 minutes from my time, and I can fix this. Why weren't you communicating this with me? And for them, it's the same problem on the other side, right? Well, you spent a lot of time. We didn't want to kind of go overhead with this. This is why you communicate with the users. The issue itself is minuscule. There's, minute or two and it's fixed. But without communicating to your users, even about small little details like colors, placement, layouts, anything specific that you need that have been using so far. If you're exporting data to Excel, what's the one thing that you're looking for? All these questions allow you to understand how to build a report. Now, once you got the colors and everything, what I also do is I create always 1 or 2 variations that the user can play around with. One of them is more advanced, one is more basic. And I can usually say to them, hey, play around with them and play around with both of them. Tell me after a week or 1 or 2 days, depending on all the deadlines and everything, right? Tell me which one feels more comfortable. And what we've understood over time is that a lot of users nowadays like to start off with an overview. Now, what I mean by that is when they open up the report for the very first time, they just want to understand what's the overall situation. So, for example, let's say this is my overall situation. I want to see how many courses I have how many courses I have, how many of them subscribers, don't have subscribers, the other way around. What's the total sales and how many total subscribers do I have? And then afterwards, I let the user ask questions with the visuals. Okay, what's happening with the beginner level, and let's say the paid version of the courses. So that is the timeline. Okay, how does it look on monthly basis? Okay, cool. What happens if I decide to switch from subject to paid? So is it paid or not? And this is one of the things to always follow as well. Make sure that your visual doesn't other visuals in the report page don't eliminate information from something else. So for example, in this case, the free and paid version is something that takes away from this one as well. So we have 2 different columns here, whereas this one only thinks there's one. So always play around with the data that you have. And this is something I can't emphasize enough. It might look good on the initial stage, but playing around also can showcase you outliers. Suddenly, one column is not rendering properly. One of the labels is too long, so what should we do about it, and so forth. All these little things makes the whole experience. I hope that answered your question, Salman. All right, I'm apologizing up front if I butcher your name, but I'm gonna try it. Xuting. I hope it was at least remotely close to how it's supposed to be pronounced. Each time I switch a value to a parameter value, the chart doesn't show values automatically. Then I need to redo everything normally. I need to make official charts first and switch to ZoomCharts. Any suggestions? So if you are using the parameters, that's what I'm going for. Yeah. So what you're referring to is that sometimes what happens is this. There you go. So let's go for publish date, and where is it? Let's say total sales here. And then I add a parameter. Okay, cool. And I also add a parameter to the slicer. And I check, it works. So sometimes everything seems to be working just fine. Sometimes when you create it, the visual is just going to give you an error message. So one of the ways on how this can be tackled is if you go over the Legends field, click on the little arrow that's pointing downwards for more options, and choose Show Value of Selected Field. And now when I do the same thing, you can see that it actually starts to split instead of using the column name. It is currently, I wouldn't call it a bug, it's sort of like an edge case that we're trying to figure out together with Microsoft. But yeah, this is one way on how you can go around it. On the Legends field itself, if you're using a parameter, enable this non-selected field, but show values of selected field. Because there's two different modes that could be utilized by default. All right. Gori, what visual did you use initially? You mean this one? If that's the one, Gori, then is the timeline visual, the drill down timeline pro. The name for it is going to be this. All right. What else? One of the things that I usually also recommend whenever you're building the reports is think about the depth of the report, right? What we notice is that a lot of users, since they're new to Power BI, especially for newer users, they're very used to having everything sort of like on a single plane, let's say it like that, right? Everything has one level of depth. They don't want to try to explore the drill down capabilities of the visuals and so forth because they're used to having things like when you click on it, it highlights where it filters it, but there's nothing more there. In reality, adding something even as simple as this, for example, right? Let's say I want to focus on the subject. Let's keep it like that, all right? But at the bottom, I could do, for example, something like this. I can choose a level. I can also go for something like is paid or not, basically creating individual donut charts. And in this case, I'm going to go for we have a level, subject, paid. To add anything else that I could add on top of it. Subject, yeah, let's just keep it 2, for example. There probably is something else more, but I don't see it at the very first glance. So theoretically, having it like this, sure, also allows me to filter out the data, but I'm utilizing or consuming a lot more space. And remember, one thing for you as a developer is that there's one precious resource that you can't just magically add, and that is space. Sure, some of you might argue and say, yeah, but you can go to the canvas settings and say, for example, instead of using 720p resolution, I could go for 1080p. Sure, you increase the size of your page, but at the same time, it's not like it's going to magically start to rise and increase. You have to define that as a prerequisite. What is the most common resolution used for your audience? Is it a 1080p monitor? Is it 720p? Is it 4K? Which, not a lot of reports are meant for 4K usage, but we do have some. So define the size of the page first, then try to figure out what kind of information needs to be displayed and what is going to be the layout. Once we have the general understanding of how things are going to be positioned and placed and so forth, you can start to play around with the charts. One thing that I can also recommend is for those of you who don't feel, let's say, very comfortable right now with creating new charts and playing around with the setups and all of that, do what I did and do what I do still sometimes. I just take a piece of paper and I draw my sketches. Just physically take a paper and draw. So that is my canvas. Here I'm going to have a few different cards. I don't know what exactly they're going to be, but they're going to be cards. And I write in always numbers so that it reflects the visual. Afterwards, I want to have underneath it like a timeline. I want that to be the first dimension that the user defines everything on. Once I have the timeline, I'm starting to think, okay, but can the timeline be divided by something? Yeah, it could. Start drawing the columns and stacks. Then I decide, okay, but I actually want to see, for example, information regarding a single course, like what's the top selling course? Sure, same again. Go, for example, I'm just talking and showing at the same time. Let's say I had the timeline, I have the dimensions here, but here on the right-hand side, I'm going to have a separate block, which is going to explain the top selling course for all those criteria that I've set there, right? Just think about the layout, what you can showcase, and how you can convey the message. That is one of the most important things. And in the beginning, we had a question, right? So what KPIs should I focus on, or what data should I focus on? Again, like I said, it's completely up to you. Find something that you see, let's say, you find interesting. So for example, I don't know for what reason, but the most important thing for me seemed like I want to see the subscribers and the courses with subscribers and no subscribers, because at first I only had these three. So I saw that we have a total number of this is the total number of courses, this is the total sales amount, and this is the total number of subscribers. I'm like, okay, yeah, cool. But then I also wanted to see, for example, in a table, I wanted to see the course ID, which is not summarized. I wanted to see the title of it, the URL for it. We convert that into a URL icon. There we go. And then a number of subscribers. And I wanted to play around with, okay, what's the bottom and the top look like? And I filtered it ascending, and I noticed that there's actually quite a bit of courses that don't have any subscribers. And that piqued my interest. So I was like, okay, I'm going to calculate how many courses have subscribers and how many do not have subscribers. It might not be the most important information for somebody else, but for me, it's something that piqued my interest. So that's what I wanted to analyze. The same with, for example, the datasets. Don't be afraid to modify them in a sense that helps you tell the story a bit better. So for example, we have the column is paid. Remember I talked about in the beginning, which is true or false based on whether it is a paid course or not. If it's the first time that somebody sees this chart, and even if I change the title and say based on the paid, let's say whether the course is paid or not, and based on count. Okay, but the true and false, somebody might understand it quite easily. For somebody, it's going to be like, what the hell does that mean? So what I did, I created basically a new column again with a little bit of text, and I changed it. And I said that, hey, if it's true, then it's paid. If it's false, then it's free. I think you're going to agree with me that even small little changes can help the user understand how it's going and how to convey the message. Think about who is going to read that. I could also go with binary values with 1 or 0, right? But what is it going to do, or how is it going to help me to convey the message to the users? They don't speak binary, right? They don't even know what binary code is. So ones and zeros are not going to help me. I need to convey the message. So I transfer that into a textual information that they can understand. All right, let's see. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so. And I see that we're running out of time as well. So, Liana, if you could paste in the feedback form. So this is the time, this is the part of the webinar where I beg for your time. And I would greatly appreciate if you could fill in the feedback forms and just tell us what you think about the webinar. It was great. It sucked. Never want to be a part of it. Want to see more. Whatever you feel, tell us about it. Whatever you think is missing, tell us about it. Any specific topic that you want us to cover, tell us about it. The more information we have, the more feedback we have, the higher the chance that we're going to be covering those topics. Because you have to understand us as well, right? So, for example, if one user wants to have a webinar on the, I don't know, the latest features that we have added to the visual, but 15 of you want to just understand how to use the combo chart, we're probably going to make a session regarding the combo chart. Just common sense. So tell us what you feel is missing or what you like, what you dislike. Just tell us everything. Same about the product. What you like, what you dislike about the visuals, what you think could be improved upon, and so forth. Helps us to understand if we're on the right path and what else can we do to make sure that things are as smooth as possible. And yeah, Leon also pasted the link to the 31st of January session where we're going to be announcing the top 5 best looking and most intuitive, let's say the top 5 reports for this challenge. I want to glorify it, right? But as always, I sometimes fail, sometimes I succeed. It's late, guys. All right, so without further ado, my final question for you guys is my favorite one. Did you learn something new and useful in today's webinar? Just write it in the chat. I just want to see and understand whether or not this was useful or was it a waste of time for you guys. All right, at least somebody learned. So for me, that is the most important thing. Like I said, I want to understand that you learn something new, useful, and you find these sessions informative. All right, thank you so much, guys, for your time, for your patience, and willingness to just sit through the session. And best of luck with your challenge reports. Remember, if you have any questions, webinars@zoomcharts.com. If nothing else, then I'll see your submission when we're reviewing and evaluating them. And hopefully, I'll see you in the next webinar and in the next challenge. All right, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, afternoon, whatever is in front of you. Bye, everyone.